Anyway, let me introduce our very, very distinguished panel, and I'll introduce them in the order that I have them here, and then they'll give you a little background on themselves. To my left is Dr. Carlos Eire. He's Dolores and Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale University, author of the award-winning book, Waiting for Snow in Havana, books, and Learning to Die in Miami, and a neighbor in Connecticut, about 20 minutes from my house. And he arrived in the United States in 1962 at the age of 11. Dr. Jose Acel is a senior scholar at the Institute for Cuban and Cuban American Studies at the University of Miami and the author of the book Mañana en Cuba. He arrived in the United States at the age of 13 in 1961. To the left of Jose is Elena Mueller Garcia, Director of Parish Social Ministry at Catholic Charities in the Diocese of Palm Beach, and she also arrived at the age of 13 in 1961. And Antonio Tony Arguiz, Chairman and CEO of MBAF, one of the top 40 accounting firms in the United States, and the immediate past chair of the Greater Miami Chamber of Commerce. And he arrived at the age of 9 in 1962. So I'm going to let them, we'll start with Elena, give a quick background on themselves, on their families in Cuba, and just to set the context for the questions that will follow. Elena?
So what was the day that you received that visa waiver? Those of you in the audience that went through Operation Pedro Pan, you probably remember the very day that you were told that you're leaving. I'm going to tell you about the day I was told I was leaving, and a little bit more. It was the 4th of July of 1961. I was downstairs. We lived in a 3-floor apartment building. I was downstairs because my parents had finally given me permission to bring a rabbit home. And I was going to get the rabbit out of the cage, and I hear my mom call me, Elena, come here. I have something very important to tell you. So I left the rabbit and I went up the stairs, and my mom tells me, we got your visa waiver. Tomorrow, you are leaving on the ferry for Miami. So we finished packing that day. On the Tuesday, July 4th, it was July 3rd that she told me I was leaving. I actually left on July 4th. We went to the port of Havana, and I just want to, we have talked about this. 99% of the Pedro Pan children left in planes, but there's about 5 of us that left on a ferry, and the other one is sitting next to me.
50% of them are here.
So we have about 40% that we know of, okay? So I left on the ferry for the Port of Palm Beach. Arrived at the Port of Palm Beach on July the 5th. It was a 24-hour trip. A relative picked me up, and the first thing I had was a Coke. And we were talking about how Coke had really gotten really bad in Cuba because Che Guevara was making it or had changed the formula. So when I arrived at the Port of Palm Beach, the friend of my family, whose name was also Elena, gave me this huge Coke, and I thought, there's no way I can drink it, but I drank it all. And then another relative, also named Elena, this is crazy, drove me to Miami that day. So it was still late in the evening, but there was still light. So I walked to a Walgreens with the relatives that welcomed me that day. And on the way back to the house, all of a sudden it hit me. Now I really cannot go back. I had seen that ocean that divided us from Cuba to Miami. And then it really hit me. My parents are in Cuba. My 3 brothers whom I adored are in Cuba. I have left my country. And now I cannot go back. And I wanted to cry, but I didn't want anybody to know how I felt. So I just swallowed my tears, and we arrived at the house. It was the Reynaldo family, and I spent my first night in the United States. So I always had that memory in me. But after I read waiting for snow in Havana, with the great memory that Dr. Avery has, that he remembers real details of life in Cuba, I said, I am going to write down my memory. But I don't have the privilege of having that great memory. So I went through some old papers that I had, and lo and behold, I found a collection of 32 letters that I had written to a friend of mine who had left Cuba the 4th of July of 1960, exactly 1 year before I left. And she had kept those letters, and her mom had given them to me many years ago, and I forgot they existed. So when I opened that batch of letters, it was like I was going back to my last year in Cuba. And so the memories that were there, but some a little fuzzy, some out of chronological order, I was able to put them all together. And so there's some highlights. How could I have left Cuba when my mom telling me the first one day, tomorrow you are leaving? Really, there was a whole year of preparation. The first time my parents had us, me and my brother Alejandro, take out pictures for the passport, we didn't want to leave Cuba without our parents. And that was in November of 1960. And I write to my friend, you know, our parents are plotting something, but Alejandro and I are not going to leave because we're not going to leave our parents and we're not going to leave Cuba without our parents. And I kept telling my friend, I want to see you soon, but here, I want you to come back. But if you don't come back, I want to see you in Miami. And those letters went back and forth, always saying, I want to see you here, but if we can't, then I want to see you in Miami. In January of 1961, I wrote her a letter saying, oh, Victoria is coming soon. Victoria was the code name for the invasion. And I'm so happy because you are going to be able to come and we're going to be able to go to school together again. So it went on like that. I was involved in some strikes because in November the government had executed a leader, a student leader, Porfirio Ramirez, and I had been involved in that strike. In February, I was involved in another strike in the school, and it got me in trouble with my teachers and the nuns in the school. But what really made me lose my hope that my friend was going to be able to come back soon was the Bay of Pig invasions. So, in May of 1961, I wrote her this. I really want to go there, even though I know that I am going to miss Mom and Dad a lot, and pretty Cuba. But there, I will be able to study and have the peace and quiet that is totally absent here. One day, you wake up hearing airplanes and bombs. At night, the gunshots from the accidentally discharged bullets and those fired on purpose don't let you sleep. If you hear a car, you think it's a plane. If it thunders, it seems like an air raid. A door that is shut hard sounds like a bomb. And finally, thousands of things that keep one in continuous shock. I have everything ready. The only thing that has to arrive is that. That was the visa waiver. When it arrives, I will for sure leave in 2 or 3 days, or maybe less. And that's exactly how it happened.
All right. Jose, do you want to?
Probably over 14,000 stories of all of us that were part of this program, and I'm really happy that we're beginning to capture these stories for posterity. I was a a student in Los Hermanos Maristas. And when I tell this to a group of Americans, they really cannot relate. But what I want to highlight is how early in life, how politically involved we were. Because I was 12 years old when I began to join the underground, and I began fighting against that regime, doing my stupid little things, delivering messages and doing some economic sabotage and things like that, participating in the strikes. And I look at my 16-year-old grandson, and he doesn't have a clue of what we were to. And we were 11, 12 years old when we became involved with the underground. My father did not know that I was involved in those kinds of activities, but I think he suspected it, and I think that was part of his motivation to, let me get this kid out of here because he is going to get killed. So a few months after, in 1961, July, I also came by a cargo ship, hiding in the ship with a group of seminarians that were actually leaving Cuba, had been ordered to leave Cuba. My mother had passed away a year earlier in 1958, and I never saw my dad again. So that is one of the stories that we need to tell. My brother, who was 17, had left a couple of months before I did. He was the one that received me in Palm Beach when I got here. And then the two of us began life, a 17-year-old and a 13-year-old. And we just made it happen. And even though there were very, very difficult times in those early years, and there were periods of severe economic hardship. I remember at one time in those early years, we were picking tomatoes in the fields in Homestead. And to go to Homestead, we had to pay $1 for the guy that drove us to the tomato fields. And you worked very hard and maybe made $3 at the end of the day. But the next day, that's what we ate. And we would take the tomatoes, for example. In the morning, we would slice it. At lunch, we would cut it into fours. And for dinner, we would just bite into the tomato just to make them look different, That was. But even though those kinds of hardships, my memories and my gratitude is enormous to the United States and to all the participants in the program. My memories are happy memories of that period of time, and I am profoundly grateful for the opportunity to have been able to grow up in freedom and to be able to carry out my dreams and to be able to go forward. So our story is one that is agridulce. Yes, there were difficult moments, but I think it also gave us the opportunity to live in freedom, an opportunity that has been denied to 11 million Cubans in the island. So to this day, we have not forgotten. All of us continue in our various different ways to contribute anything that we can to hopefully bring about freedom finally for those in Cuba. Thank you.
Thank you. Tony?
Well, what I remember, I do remember I left Cuba March 24th of 1962, and I kind of figured after all the religious schools were closed down, I also went to Los Maristas en La Víbora, Havana, Cuba. And right around April or May of 61, if my recollection is correct, all of the private schools were closed down then. So, I mean, what was I going to do? I couldn't go to school, and my mom would tell me at home, no vas a ningún colegio that they're going to indoctrinate you. And that was the whole situation right after that. I mean, I at the time was 8 years old in 61, and what happened, September started around, and if you remember, in each of the blocks in Cuba, they had a house that was kind of like the mainstay where the secret or people would tell on each other. And they would keep track of everybody in that same block. And I remember like it was yesterday. So my mom would walk me out to go to a school on every day starting in September. It was really about 3 or 4 blocks from my house. I had a private teacher that really helped me out until I was able to leave Cuba. And I remember like in February of '62 or so, my mom tells me, and I knew she had been working on something, mañana we have an appointment at the Pan American offices in Pedro, which we went the next day, and I still remember I got into a fight with another kid at the Pan American offices that day. But I came back home, and she had told me it was 30 days before I would leave, and that ended up being March 24th of '62. When I flew on a Pan Am flight, I still remember my mom. I mean, you know, when you see El Pecero there, God, I remember like it was yesterday. And the separation from my mom, my dad couldn't withstand going to that airport. I'm sorry. Anyway, and going into Pecera, I remember my mom had made a suit for me. I mean, it was going to be a wool suit. It was going to be so cold. It was going to be so cold in the United States. And I also had a coat in my arm. And the miliciano that was right at the entrance of the Pecera says, it's either the coat or your suit. So my mom said, take off the coat of your suit and just take el abrigo because you're going to be in cold weather, you know, here in the state. So I finally left, and there was actually a young lady, probably about 4 years. I was 9 then, maybe a 13-year-old, and her mom, who must have been in her early 30s. And they were Cubanos de color. And my mom told them, please take care of him until he's able to get to Miami. And I still remember when we left on the plane, everybody clapping when we took off. I mean, once that plane took off, everybody in the plane went crazy. Because in reality, everybody was scared until you took off. You didn't even know. Because I remember once you got outside the Pecera and they checked your bags, I mean, that was an ordeal. They went through every item in your suitcase, and obviously, you know, I had a gusano because we wanted to keep the weight down so I could take as much as possible of the weight limit that we had. And, you know, I still remember the guy checking my suitcase, and my dream and passion was to pitch in the major leagues, which I never made it. And I had a 4-finger baseball glove. I wish I still would have had that today. I gave it away as I outgrew it, but the guy was, the militiaman kept telling me, what do you need that for? What do you need that for? I finally talked him into allowing me to take it with me. So I got to Miami. I was lucky enough that I had a brother 19 years older from the same mother and father. And he drove down from Tampa to get me. I was able to live with him for about 5 or 6 months until I went, since he couldn't take care of me, went back to the Catholic Charities, who basically became my guardian for 5 years. And I was able to go to an old boy boarding school in Tampa, run by the Salesians of Don Bosco. And I lived there, 200 students, I guess 50 of us were Pedro Pan. And all these years, you know, we had so many happy but sad days because it started to dwindle. People's parents were getting here. And you were really happy and excited, but sad too because your parents did not arrive. But anyway, life teaches us a lot, and I guess all of us learned quite a bit from that experience.
Well, I left on April 6, 1962, so just a few days after you. One day, one of my kids, I can't remember which of the three, said, "Dad, you have too many birthdays," because I count every move I made as a birthday. So April 6th is my second birthday. September 1st is my third birthday. That's when I moved to Illinois. November 3rd is my fourth birthday. That's when I moved to Chicago, and so on. Dad, you have too many birthdays. We can't remember them all. I don't remember when I was told that I was leaving. But when I was told, I was so happy. Of course, I feared leaving my parents. I feared going to a strange place where I only knew how to make basic sentences in English, such as, he is my brother, and most important, I don't eat chicken. So I was happy because I felt like I was being strangled to death in Cuba. Not just intellectually, but spiritually and even physically. The oppression was unbearable. Keep in mind, at that, I'm 9, 10 years old. And I feel like somebody's trying to suck the soul out of me, turn me into some kind of zombie. And just about when she was about to depart from this earth, my mom said, "You know why we sent you away, don't you?" Well, she would always ask, "Are you glad? Are you happy we sent you away?" But shortly before she died, she said, "You know why we sent you away? Because you had lengua larga." You had a long tongue. You had loose lips, whatever. And unlike Joe, I didn't join the resistance, but I used to yell at the milicianos, and I used to yell at the pioneers. And I remember they used to march past my house, the little pioneers. It's the communist Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, and everybody has to join. I remember they'd pass our house shouting slogans, and I and my friends would hide in the bushes and yell back, 1, 2, 3, 4, comiendo mierda y gastando zapatos. 1, 2, 3, 4, you know.
You understand.
You understand.
Should the moderator translate or no? No.
Yeah, you translate. It's your sin. It's your sin if you translate. I'm clear.
I'll send out a group text.
Yeah, no.
4, 3, 2, 1, suena un pedo y no queda ninguno.
That was for the teenagers. I never learned that. But anyway, my mom said, I went out to the porch one day and I saw you and your friends doing that. And that's when I decided, you can't stay here. I'm eternally grateful. And it is hard not to get emotional. I'm trying to do what a friend of mine who's an Episcopal priest told me. He says, anytime you're choking up, just pinch your butt cheeks. just. And it works. It works. You should try it sometime. Of course, no Catholic priest would tell you that. But anyway, it is hard not to get emotional. All this stuff gets recycled and it comes out. And I was happy. I was so happy that I was leaving. But of course, I feared leaving. I feared leaving my family. I feared being alone. I remember everyone clapping on the plane. I remember the Pecera all too well. It seems like I was in there for 1,000,000 years. That's relative to other memories I have. That's about the space it takes up. Something weird happened, though, when I wrote Waiting for Snow in Havana. I said, and it says so in the last chapter, none of my friends came to say goodbye at the airport. Because most of my friends had already left. I was one of the last of my group, my childhood group, to leave. But I had some new friends that I had made in between. And I said, none of my friends came to see me. Well, lo and behold, the book is published. I'll make this long story as short as possible. I end up meeting with one of those new neighborhood friends in 2004, of all places, in Paris. When I meet him, first question he asks is, because he had read the book, so he was testing me, and he said, do you remember me being at the airport to say goodbye? I had to say, no, I don't. Then he described everything in perfect detail. Everything, including who had traveled in which car. So he was there. And that was shocking to me. Even more shocking, he said, you know, it's too bad you don't remember that day, because that was the most important day of my life. Because that's when I realized that something was wrong here. And that was, as he put it, my first step towards prison. Because he would end up spending 8 years in prison later for his lengua larga. Okay, and his name is Miguel Sales Figueroa. What does that tell you? Is my book wrong? Is my memory wrong? No, my memory's not wrong. I was focused on my parents, my grandparents. I was excited. One thing I've learned as an adult is that, you know, mixed feelings is all we have. We don't have any 100% pure feelings. We always have mixed feelings. And as a kid, it's impossible to understand that. But I had the mixed feelings. Took off, beautiful feeling, but sad feeling. You know, I won't go into details about my life in the United States, because if you've read my books, you know what that is. And if you haven't read my books, well, buy them.
You should get a general history about the program first, and then...
Yes, definitely. Absolutely essential. So, you know, I was blessed. People ask me, same question my mom kept asking me. Are you glad we sent you off? I always say yes. Would you do that to your children is the other question I get. I said, if I had the limited knowledge my parents had of the big picture, but I had the same challenges and dangers facing my children, of course I would do it. And then, of course, when your own children get to be teenagers, you do want to send them away. So, tit for tat, but I am, I'll close with this, okay. I saw out there in the exhibit lots of little religious books that kids took with them, because we were allowed to take one book, and our parents gave us the book. Usually we never got to pick. I would have brought a Superman comic book, but coming here today, I had to give a talk about August sometime, and I was asked to talk about a specific book. So it was still in my coat pocket, and I picked this jacket to bring here, and I sit down, and I feel this bulk in my pocket. And what book is it? It's the book my parents gave me. This is not the exact book. It's the same text, but the English translation. It's in my pocket. The Imitation of Christ. Scariest book you can give any child. So scary. Plus, I was told, if you ever have any questions or any problems, and I'd like to see a show of hands if you were told the same thing about this book, open it at random and you'll find the answer. That's all. It's usually something really scary. But later on, saved my life. I was living in Chicago with my mom in a basement apartment. She couldn't find work. My brother had dropped out of high school. and was working full-time. I was going to high school because I couldn't drop out, I was too young, and working full-time at night. I started reading this. It stopped being scary. It made sense. It made perfect sense. It allowed me to let go of everything. And also, very oddly, because I had outgrown my clothes, that little book was the only thing I had left from my life in Cuba. I felt the presence of everyone left behind. But more importantly, reading this book convinced me someone else is looking out for you. And it's always looking out for you. And no matter how bad things get, no matter how awful they seem, everything is working for a good end and a good purpose. So I'll end with that.
Let's start with Elena again. Now, I know a lot of you, having spoken to so many Pedro Pan alumni, I guess you would call them. Tell me a little bit about your assimilation, speaking English, or tell me what happened after you came, where you went to school, and about the whole process of assimilating to the culture, or the difficulties or the successes.
Well, the first days, my first 2 months, July and August, I spent in Miami. And I remember everywhere I went, I saw an exit sign, and I thought, este es el país del éxito. I had no idea that it was. So, but little by little, I thought I knew English, but I really didn't know. I went to Las Ursulinas in La Habana, and we had English every afternoon. But when I arrived in Miami, I couldn't understand a word on television. I could not understand a word on the radio. So I felt really, really lost. I didn't know any English. I remember in September, I received a letter from one of the nuns from my school in Havana, but she was no longer in Havana. And she told me that I had been given a scholarship to attend school in Ursuline Academy in Dallas, Texas. And I accepted it. I was very homesick in Miami, and I said, well, I might as well just be further away. And so I went to Dallas, Texas, and I remember when a lady picked me up at the airport, and when I arrived at the school, the nuns came to greet me, and a nun said something to me, and I said, yeah. And she said, no, it's yes. So that was my...
Yes, sister.
Sister, yes, yeah. So I was extremely, extremely shy. So I didn't want to speak. I was the only Cuban in my class in the 8th grade at Ursuline Academy. And towards the end of the year, we were given an assignment to write an essay after we had gone to a picnic. So our teacher, Mother Ruth, told me in front of the whole class that I had to read my essay to all the other students. And I said, I cannot read it. And she said, well, if you don't read it, no one is going to go home. So I had all these eyes looking at me, and I was really in tears, but I didn't want to have my friends remember forever that I had kept them in the school overnight. So I read my little essay, and when I finished reading it, my friends clapped. And then I lost my fear of speaking English. And from then on, I was more, of course I kept making all kinds of mistakes, but I wasn't that afraid. Years later, I wanted to write, and I had this ambivalence about, do I write in English or do I write in Spanish? And it became like a dilemma. It became like an internal struggle. And I remember writing in my diary, I want to find a palm tree and die because I cannot speak English, I cannot speak Spanish. And then later on, I also wrote in my diary, I learned English and now I can relate to a whole new set of people. I am so glad I have learned it. So it was a hard experience. There were many obstacles, many difficult times, but it was quite an achievement.
Tony, do you remember your assimilation in learning English?
It was very difficult. I arrived in Tampa, and nothing like Miami nowadays that you don't really need to speak English. You can communicate. I mean, I have clients over the years that built amazing businesses and didn't even speak a word of English. But getting to Tampa was tough. But I had great math skills, thank God. So I couldn't speak, but I knew math well. So I entered the 3rd grade in Tampa, Grady Elementary, in a rich area now. All the Cubans used to live there, Hyde Park, in the old days and rent apartments there. And I went through 3rd grade there, and one of the first things, like about 3 weeks down, I was only there 44 days and the school year was over. But about the 3rd week into it, I remember the teacher kind of learned that I knew math and multiplication, division, and all quite well. So I do remember part of this. The whole class would get on one side of the room and I on the other, and they would write calculations on the board and who could come up with the answer first. And then right after that, that whole summer is when I went in with the Catholic Charities and started. I had to skip 4th grade to start in this old boy boarding school where I lived for 5 years until my parents were able to leave Cuba in '67. So that was a great place because you had a lot of Cuban kids, except the priest wouldn't allow you to speak Spanish. And so you had to speak Spanish in hiding most of the time. And it took a while. I mean, I thought I knew a little English by the time I got to that school, but in reality, I did learn the language much better within the 60, 90 days of having matriculated and commenced the school year sometime in September of '62.
Jose, you remember?
Yeah, well, we arrived here in the summer, and my first school was Shenandoah Junior High. I don't know if anybody here remembers Shenandoah Junior High. Okay. And my first few classes, the only class that I was sure what it was the math class, because they kept doing numbers on the blackboard. The other classes had no idea if they were English or history or whatever. I did not understand anything. So it was difficult at first, but you began to assimilate. And I think the most difficult part was the following year, I ended up in Alamerit, which at that time was kind of a difficult school. And there were a lot of tensions and a lot of fights and a lot of resentment, I think, at that time by the younger American kids at the time, and we just got into a lot of fights. So I just remember that, the fighting all the time. And eventually ended up in Miami Senior High. And I was always involved in Cuban activities. I was, before I graduated from Miami High in '66, I was actually expelled because those of you that might have gone to Miami High, there was a bust of Jose Marti in the school, and I had tried to organize a ceremony there, I think, of some sort, and the principal did not allow me to do it, so I decided I was going to steal that bus and take it home that night. So went into the school grounds, of course the whole thing is 2,000 pounds, there was no way I could move that thing out of there. So I was expelled from school from doing that. So we were always involved. I guess the activism for me was always there in those early days. Even got involved with some CIA training and things of that nature, even at that early age.
Okay. Carlos, what do you remember? Everglades Elementary.
Oh, Everglades Elementary School, yes, those portable classrooms. on stilts in the back where they put the Cuban kids, and put us through there pretty quickly, and then put us into the real classrooms as soon as they thought we could handle it. But I was lucky in that my first foster family was American, two wonderful people, Norma and Louis Chait. And my brother was taken in by a couple who were friends with the Chaits, Sid and Carol Rubin. As you can guess from the names, yes, they were American Jews. They were Jewish. So I learned English immediately because they didn't speak any Spanish. I also learned some Yiddish that I thought was English. Later on, when I moved to Bloomington, Illinois, population 36,000, and there were only two of us in Bloomington Junior High School who had not been born in the United States. There was me, and there was Rutger Stroink, whose father had been a Luftwaffe pilot, and he got all the abuse. I didn't have to get into fights with I'd use a Yiddish word, and people wouldn't understand me. I'd say, "What is that?" "Yeah, well, you're a schmuck." "What? What? What's that?" "I'm sorry, I don't know." So I learned English really fast, and then I tried to get rid of my accent, because at Everglades Elementary, when I was put into the main classroom, the kids made fun of me one day when I said something was easy. And they all started chanting, "Easy, easy, easy." And then they called me Easy Boy. And I said, "I'm going to lose this accent." So I picked, out of the TV programs, the two that I thought had the most beautiful American accent. Beverly Hillbillies and Andy Griffith. So when I ended up at Senn High School in Chicago, where our principal, and there's at least one person in this room who can verify this, our principal had a map of the world with pins on it, right? And he didn't have enough pins for Cuba. But there were pins all over the map except for Australia. Kids would ask me, "Are you from the South?" And I'd say, "Yeah, but you have no idea how far south." But I was discultured, as happened to all of us Pedro Panes who were sent far away from Miami, places like Bloomington, Illinois. It was pretty hard to stay Cuban, fully Cuban. Yeah, I lost touch with a lot of Cuban things. In Bloomington, I'll end with this. This is how desperate. I was living with my uncle in Bloomington, who took us in, and we couldn't get any Cuban food. Even if we drove the 120 miles to Chicago, it was hard at that time to find Cuban food in Chicago. So my uncle found that Campbell's soup made black bean soup, which was horrible. And it had no beans in it. It was just liquid. And it didn't taste like black beans, but it was black bean soup. And we had that just about every day in Bloomington, Illinois, because it was as close as we could get to being Cuban.
All right. Tell me about when your parents came, Tony. It was 5 years, and what was the reunion like, and the adjustment?
Well, it's kind of crazy, the reunion. I remember, my brother still lived in Tampa outside of the school, and we were waiting because my parents actually got returned. Once they got to the airport, they were returned back to Havana like 5 different times. It was on the 6th time that they were able to leave the country. So we were expecting them from 66. I think the Freedom Flights in 65, they started again. We were expecting them in 66. Thank God there was a congressman in Tampa by the name of Sam Givens. And my brother told me, write Sam Givens. And I would write to him every month. And Sam Givens, my brother would tell me, would make sure that they were brought closer, or they were up on the list to get out earlier. So, I mean, I kept writing Sam Gibbons. If he only knew I became a Republican, but... But, you know, Sam Gibbons just died about 3 years ago in his 90s in Tampa. So he helped out. My parents finally got here sometime in March of '67. I don't remember the date like I know the date I left Cuba. And my brother told me they're here. He called me at the school. My brother was kind of a crazy guy, 19 years older, and he's telling me, "Vamos a Miami. You know, let's get in the car." And then the priest at the school said, you know, just relax, let them go through the proper channels. My parents were greeted here in Miami by all their friends. And after 2 days, they came to Tampa. And Tampa at that time, you look at the airport today, it's a nice airport. It was built in the early 70s by Dick Greco, who was a mayor of Tampa. But that airport back then in '67 was like a baseball field almost with a building. So they got there, and I remember, I mean, I had like a sports coat on. I was with my brother, his kids, and it was just amazing to see them. It was at night that they got there. It must have been 8 o'clock at night, but wow. It was something else. And, you know, so they arrived, and I still remember over at Berry University, they have Pedro archives, and you're not supposed to see them. But there was this old nun there who I befriended, and she said, "All right, go. I didn't see you." And I went in there and I checked it out, and there, gosh, the letters, what amazing history. I started reading one of the letters, and there was like 3 or 4 letters back and forth between the Archdiocese in Miami and the social workers that were taking care of me outside of the boarding school. And it was, you have to give him to his parents. We're not the legal guardian. After 14 days that they arrive in the U.S., and the social workers kept saying, he's almost finished after being 5 years at that school. Let him finish that school. So somehow they let me finish the school. So I was really still without him until June of that year. And then I moved into my parents. And that was a big, big change because, I mean, I think that as an exile, we had already accomplished something after 5 years. And guess what? We had to go live with my brother in a room where we had 2 double beds, the bunk beds, and then my nephew, who had arrived at a year old, had his crib in the middle. So, I mean, we were living in a room, probably 3/4 of this platform here, and we really lived there for about 5 or 6 months until we were able to rent a house near my brother in Tampa, and then I started high school in Tampa, and finally it took me 3 years to graduate, 10 and 12, 11 and 12th grade, and then I went off to college, and I was lucky enough to come to Miami and meet my wife and stay here finally.
All right. Carlos, you want to?
Yeah, reunion was bittersweet. Like Elena, I was told I had a 1-day warning in Bloomington, Illinois. I was living with my uncle and aunt, my 2 cousins, and my brother. And I liked Bloomington. I had made a lot of friends, but I had 1 day to say goodbye to everybody. And something very similar to leaving Cuba. I only had 1 suitcase. Everything I owned fit in 1 suitcase. And we met our mom at Union Station in Chicago, because that's what the refugio said to her. Basically, let's see, you don't have any English, you don't have any skills because you were a housewife, and you're physically handicapped because my mom got polio when she was 9 months old and had a bad leg. So you have all these conditions. The place for you is Chicago. Yeah, and the reason they gave her, if I remember correctly, is we've sent a few Cubans there already, so you'll have some people there. Do you know anyone? And she knew someone who was a friend of a friend of a friend. But guess what? They took us in. They had a small, tiny apartment. 2 adults, and their son was in his 20s. They had just been reunited, and they took us in, and we slept on a sofa bed, and my mom slept on a cot. But of course, my dad stayed behind, and he never got to leave, so I never saw him again. But in Chicago, the reunion was very, very bittersweet in that suddenly, and I've talked to other Pedro Panes, it's a great adjustment. You stop being a child and you become basically your parent, especially because of the English issue. You have to translate everything, which can work to your advantage. I know one person at our high school who was suspended and went home and said to his parents, "Hey, look, I'm doing so well, they gave me a week off." Could you please sign here? Sign
What a
here.
country.
Yeah. Or I know someone else who's told his parents, F is the highest grade.
Elena, do you want to jump in?
Well, my parents came in the summer of 1964, and like you, I don't remember the exact date. I think it was in the month of June. But I had been kept in touch with my parents through letters. So I had many letters that I wrote my parents. I told them I wanted to write a diary, but I didn't have time. So would they save the letters? And they did. Somehow I got all the letters that I wrote them, I got them back. So I have been reading them recently, and many of the letters, they tell me, "Oh, we think we got the visa waiver." And my dad would write in detail what the visa waiver was, but then it wasn't the real one. Or one member of the family would get the visa waiver and the other one not. So it took them until 1964 when they were finally able to leave through a third country. They had to go from Havana to Mexico. From Mexico, they just went to Panama to change planes. And from Panama, they went to Bogota, Colombia, where my dad had a cousin who had been there, had left from Cuba and was there for about 3 or 4 years. So my parents stayed in Colombia for about 1 month. And they finally arrived in Miami in that summer of 1964. I had the relationship with my parents through letters. Now when they are here at the airport, it's different. It's a different type of relationship. I was overjoyed. I was very happy they finally were here, but at the same time, there was an adjustment to make. I was still attending school at Ursuline Academy, but I would spend the summers in Miami, first with my relatives, and eventually when my parents came with them. So I wanted to finish high school. My parents came between my sophomore and junior year. I went back to Dallas that summer, and I would come back to them at Christmas and the next summer. So it was a happy occasion, but it had adjustments that had to be made.
Do you want to add something?
Well, no, I was just trying to remember some things as Carlos was talking, that there were some very special skills that we all had to learn as Pedro Paz, and I'm sure some of you remember these skills. We had to learn, for example, how to cook la carne del refugio in very different ways, because to make it look different, it was just in those early days, we ended up, my brother and I, we rented an old house. It was a dilapidated house. It was falling apart. And that house ended up being like an informal refugee for every Cuban that was arriving at the time could come and stay with us. But the other skill that we tried to figure out was what to do con la mantequilla de maní, the peanut butter. We had absolutely no idea what to do with this thing. And we ended up, everybody's asking, what do you do with this thing? So we ended up opening that and putting it in a bucket, putting water on it, and then passing it around so we could steer, see if we could make it. We didn't have a blender or anything like that. So when you got tired, you pass it to the next guy, and the next guy would steer it, see if we could. So, but those are the skills that we had to master at that time, I think.
Churning peanut butter. Okay, we're going to take some, we can take about 3 or 4 questions. We've come to the end of the program. I just wanted to say that, in my own research, I was getting my PhD in history. I was a Europeanist, and I was majoring in 20th century Italy. And then, really when I realized how many incredible stories exist where I came from, because probably everyone here can tell similar stories that they told. I said, wow, there's some pretty exceptional people that I grew up around, and I'm very honored to have written about them and to keep writing about them. So thank you, panel, and thank all of you. We're going to take a few questions. Make sure, based on experience, it is a question, okay? and a brief one at that. Yes?
I have 2 questions.
Oh, okay.
The first one is for you.
Me?
Yes.
Okay.
So the Castros must have known. I mean, 14,000 is a lot.
Sure,
It's a lot
absolutely.
more than 3.
Yeah.
So they must have known what was going on. Why did they let the children come?
Well, I think it's impossible for them not to have known. You're not going to have 14,000 emotional goodbyes at the national airport without them knowing. I think, and Carlos, you can jump in here if you like. To them, it benefited them. I mean, they were losing, there were almost very few restrictions at the time on leaving the country to begin with. They didn't start cracking down on immigration really seriously until later. Their enemies were leaving, their potential enemies were leaving. These were the people who culturally weren't going to adjust to communism, and in fact, they're probably going to fight against it. So the fact that they were leaving, I mean, why would they stop it if it's their potential, their current and future, in the case of the children, people who are going to cause cause them problems are voluntarily leaving. And Carlos, you can speak to this a little bit more.
The historian footnotes the historian.
Right.
Once at Yale several years ago, we had a speaker, Carlos Franchi, who was very high, very, very high in the Castro regime. He was in charge of some magazine. He was basically like sub-minister of propaganda. What was it? Granma? Or Revolucion? Well, he came and gave us a talk about why he had been purged in Cuba. And as he told us, the reason he was purged is that he was the only real socialist. But anyway, afterwards at dinner, after a couple of glasses of wine, I elbowed him and I said, "Hey, Tocayo, tell me, why did you let us leave?" And then with a big smile on his face, grinning ear to ear, he said, "Because anything that would destroy the bourgeois family was music in our ears." Yeah.
The second question, so the kids that came in the early 1960s transformed Miami from a backwater city into like a major metropolitan city. They were very successful. Would these children, do you think, if they were left in Cuba, attain the same kind of success?
In communist Cuba?
Not under communism, but
Okay.
if they had remained in Cuba. I mean, was the experience of being a Pedro Pan child, did that make these children want to succeed?
Well, I'll defer to the panel on this. They can answer better
Well,
than I can.
that's actually a very, very, very interesting question, and I have asked myself in other ways. The experience, I think, made us want to work harder and push harder and succeed. It was very important, I know for me, to honor my father. And a way of honoring my father was to be successful. So I think had I stayed even in a without Castro Cuba, even in a Republican Cuba, my path would have been probably a more regular path. I would have gone to the university, become a lawyer probably like my dad, and more or less. But I think having to struggle here probably made us achieve more, because it was a challenge for us to do that. And I don't know if you feel the same.
We hear a lot of positive stories of what's happened, but there had to be a lot of negatives. And the entire situation and being in a foreign country without your parents, not knowing the language, being by yourself, it had to be very difficult for other people too. So we don't know about those stories of people that didn't really fare well. It's not published enough, and I don't think a lot of research has been done in that area. But you know, obviously the experience not having anything and having to succeed in life, I mean, I look at my kids and they haven't really had that opportunity, which, you know, it's crazy because for me, I mean, I had to struggle for everything, even in high school. When my parents got here in '67, they wanted me to attend a Catholic school. Well, I had to work and play sports and go to school at the same time. Even through college, the same thing. Although I had a baseball scholarship, I did work study, and I studied too. And, you know, that really made you into the person that you are. But you know, I think the biggest thing that helped me in my career was my first job, and I got fired about a year and a half into it. And I still remember like it was yesterday, and the guy told me, he's my biggest competitor today, he's 81 years old, but he helped me out back then, and he said, you know, Ortiz, you're a good guy, but you'll never make it in public accounting. And I left that office crying that Friday night. He had even met me in jeans. That's how little he thought of me at that time. And you know, it was always a goal in my life to build an accounting firm that would beat him to his to the ground. And you know, that, but you know, the Pedro Pan experience helped out amazing.
Hi. My question is kind of a companion to yours. You know, in life, this program has such resonance in terms of we see children and families dying on beaches and drowning, and countries not welcoming them. The question is, Cuba let the people leave. Why, in the light of our tortured response to many other horrible situations where refugees were fleeing certain death and totalitarianism, why was this strictly a humanitarian response, or was it part of the Cold War hysteria that we were just
I would say it was part of both.
One-upmanship?
Yeah, remember, in the early 60s immigration from Cuba occurred at a time, first of all, where it was not a heavy time of immigration to the United States. The United States changed its immigration laws in the 1920s, which very, very seriously limited immigration. And there was some after World War II, but a lot of the refugees after World War II, some of them made their way here, but not a whole lot. So there hadn't really been a large wave of immigrants to the United States or refugees for a long time, and or not in recent memory. The fact that it was the Cold War was extremely important, and I made the case this morning in an interview. It was very important for the United States. This was a time when there was a global showcase of Americanism and communism. And in many parts of the globe, this was also a time of decolonization in Africa and in Asia, movements in Latin America, and there was a competition in these countries, sometimes the competition that ended up in war, but of what path to follow, Americanism or the way of the Soviet Union. And in places that did become flashpoints, it was very important for the United States to demonstrate its loyalty to its allies, and what the United States did with the Cubans and the Cuban refugees was being witnessed by the whole world, and they didn't want people to lose faith in the United States, in the partnership of the United States. If the United States had turned away Cuban refugees at that point, it would have been, people who were the decision makers believed it would have had massive repercussions throughout the world, which is very different than today, and even very different from 1980, because in the 1980 Mario boat lift, for instance, things had changed. New immigration laws had been passed by President Johnson, so there was already, by 1980, years of immigration, largely from the third world. People had experienced that. There was an economic decline. There was the Vietnam War. There were Vietnamese refugees. So if you look at how the United States responded to the Mariel refugees versus the early 1960s, besides some important differences, how people viewed refugee waves was very different 20 years later than it was in 1960, and it was humanitarian. I mean, it served U.S. interest early on. It certainly did, because everything was getting ready for the Bay of Pigs invasion. So anything we could do to help, if we're being, if someone's requesting that we open this door for children, and that's somehow going to help the invasion, great. We'll open it. What do you need? And I don't think there was this diabolical plot on anybody's part. I mean, they allowed this initially in preparation for the invasion, and I think the U.S. government, even after the invasion failed, that gate was open with the visa waivers, and they just said, just leave it open and leave the other visa waivers open. So I don't think anybody sat down and made as some people accuse, some diabolical scheme to, cause all of these problems. And so, yeah, I think it's very different. I think when you look at immigration and Americans' response to it, very difficult to compare one era to another era. The Cubans were very lucky in the early 1960s that those conditions existed in the American political culture. If it happened later, it happened 20 years earlier, it might have been a very different reception. So, all right, are we done? Are we ready, or do we have time for one more question?
I have a question.
Sure.
Well, I used to be the assistant to the commanding officer in Iceland. And the commanding officer went to the War College in Washington when he came back. I asked him why the Cuban immigration, and he said, we discussed that at the War College, and the reason why they did it because they felt so bad about not supporting the Bay of Pigs.
Right, yeah, oh, certainly. And yeah, I mean, and by that time, the door was open. Yeah. I mean, by that time, they were granting visa waivers for adults, visa waivers for kids. But then there was that guilt, and President Kennedy, shortly before the Bay of Pigs, did create the Cuban refugee program. It would, many people say, well, it would have been better if he just would have done what he was supposed to do at the Bay of Pigs. He wouldn't have needed the Cuban refugee program. But it was very large and very, very comprehensive. Everything from retraining doctors to a refugio to paying for Catholic boarding school somewhere or foster families, and it was very, very comprehensive. And so, yeah, I mean, part of it was probably motivated by that. And then not only that, because that was already an immigration that was occurring. When the Bay of Pigs occurred, that wave was already going on. But certainly later, when it came 1965, boat lift, which lasted just a few weeks, and then the freedom flights after that, a lot of that same thinking went into that. We have to help these people, and what's the rest of the world going to think? And then, people are going to lose faith in us in other parts of the world. So, okay, we done? Is that it? Okay, well, thank you all very much. And thank you to the panel.
Just a few words before we finish. Thank you again for coming out today. Please do see the exhibit before you head out today. Another thank you for Victor Triad doing a great job moderating the panel.
I didn't have to do much.
And Carlos, Jose, Elena, and Tony for helping us out. This is their story, and the exhibit is all about Pedro Pans. Thank you. Community of Children, 55 years of child services. Engaging conversation about the state of children in our community relates to some of the questions you asked today. And if you like this program and you like our exhibit, please support us through our membership. We have many levels of opportunity for funding. And I want to give a special thank to Carmen Valdivia and Camiseta Romanage and the Operation Pedro Pan Group, Inc., which helped us curate this exhibition, and all the Pedro Pans out there. Thank you for a wonderful job. Thank you. Please join us in the lobby for refreshments, I believe.